In the marble halls of the wealthy, mercy was often mistaken for weakness, and kindness could cost a life. When a humble hotel maid dares to help a dying stranger, she is cast out in disgrace, unaware that her act of compassion will bind her forever to one of the city's most powerful men. What begins as a story of ruin soon becomes a battle between pride and redemption, where love must rise above scandal, secrets, and the cruel whispers of society. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And do you believe that kindness can truly change a heart marked by grief? New York City, winter of 1897. The air smelled of coal smoke and snow, and the streets around Madison Square shimmered with the faint glow of gas lamps. Inside the Wellington Hotel, velvet drapes softened the roar of the city, while chandeliers flickered above the marble floor. Guests in silk and fur moved like a restless tide through the grand parlor, their laughter echoing beneath ceilings painted with cherubs and gold leaf. Georgia Whitlow, 29 years old, moved quietly among them. Her grey cotton uniform, pressed and spotless, contrasted with the jeweled gowns around her. She carried a tray of teacups with practiced grace, her head bowed, her hair hidden beneath a white linen cap. Though invisible to most, her eyes missed nothing: the flicker of a gentleman's disdain, the nervous tremor of a woman hiding her loneliness, the subtle cruelty of wealth that never looked down. A sudden sound broke the quiet hum of the parlor, a delicate gasp, followed by the crash of porcelain. Georgia turned. Near the fireplace, an elderly woman had collapsed, her gloved hand clutching the air for help. The guests froze, conversations stopped. No one moved. Without thinking, Georgia set her tray aside and rushed forward. She knelt beside the woman, her fingers trembling as she loosened the lady's collar and spoke softly, "You are safe now. Breathe slowly, ma'am." The woman's face was pale as marble, her silver hair pinned with care, and a small gold locket hung around her neck, glinting in the light. "Fetch a physician," Georgia called to a footman nearby. But the man hesitated, glancing toward the hotel manager standing at the far end of the room. Mr. Harcourt, a tall man with a thin smile and eyes colder than the marble floor, stepped forward. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Miss Whitlow, step away at once. You are not to touch the guests." "She fainted, sir," Georgia replied, her voice calm though her heart raced. "She needs help. Please, some water." "Enough!" His voice cracked like a whip. "Do you wish to shame this establishment? Remove your hands from her immediately." But Georgia stayed by the woman's side, ignoring the murmur that rippled through the parlor. With the gentleness of a sister, she brushed a strand of silver hair from the woman's forehead and whispered, "You'll be all right, I promise." The woman opened her eyes for a fleeting moment, gazing at Georgia as if recognizing her from another life. Her lips quivered, but no sound escaped. Then her eyes fluttered closed once more. A physician finally arrived, summoned by another maid, and Georgia stepped back. The old woman was carried away toward her suite, her locket slipping from her neck to the carpet. Georgia picked it up carefully and placed it in the doctor's hand. When she turned, Mr. Harcourt was already waiting, fury simmering behind his measured tone. "You have disgraced this house, Miss Whitlow. Do you imagine your pity is welcome among our guests?" "I only did what anyone decent would have done," she murmured. He leaned closer. "Then perhaps you should seek employment among the decent. You're dismissed. Collect your things." The words struck like a blow. Georgia stood silent, her face pale yet steady. She curtsied faintly, her voice trembling only once. "As you wish, sir." By evening, the Grand Hotel gleamed behind her as she stepped into the bitter cold. Snowflakes melted against her cheeks, tracing the path of unshed tears. The city stretched before her, harsh, vast, and indifferent. She walked without direction, her small suitcase clutched in her hands. Passing the glittering windows of carriages and cafes, she could see the reflections of women draped in luxury, their laughter untouched by fear. For them, the world was built on silk and security. For her, it had always been built on labor and silence. Her boots left faint impressions on the snow-dusted pavement as she crossed Broadway, heading toward the narrow street where her boarding house waited. In the flickering lamplight, she passed a beggar child coughing in the shadows. Georgia paused, took off her woolen shawl, and wrapped it gently around the child's shoulders. "Keep warm, little one," she whispered. The child's wide eyes glimmered in the darkness. Inside her modest room, the wallpaper faded and the stove unlit. Georgia sat at the edge of her narrow bed. Her hands were still cold from the walk, but her heart was colder. From her small trunk, she took out a sheet of music, an old waltz she had once played at a charity hall before life narrowed into survival. Her fingers traced the notes as if touching something sacred. She closed her eyes, and the memory of the elderly woman's gaze returned, fragile, imploring, filled with unspoken gratitude. Georgia wondered whether the woman had survived the night, whether she would ever know her name. Outside, the wind carried the city's endless hum. Georgia lay down, whispering a prayer into the darkness, unaware that somewhere beyond the snow and gaslights, a carriage bearing the Rockefeller crest was already on its way, its wheels cutting silently through the frozen streets toward her fate. The winter sun rose pale and cold over New York City, casting long shadows across the tenement rooftops and shivering window panes. In the boarding house on East 23rd Street, the corridors still echoed with the creaks of early risers. Coal smoke curled through vents, mingling with the scent of burnt porridge and damp wool. Georgia Whitlow sat silently by the frosted window, wrapped in her only remaining shawl, her breath clouding the pain as she stared into the street below. She had not slept. The dismissal from the hotel still weighed upon her chest like wet stone, its shame pressing against her ribs with every shallow breath. But it was not just the loss of employment that unsettled her. It was the face of the old woman, the silent collapse, the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the locket that fell into Georgia's palm. She could not shake the feeling that something had passed between them, something unspoken, yet urgent. The clatter of hooves broke the hush of morning. Georgia turned. Down the slushy cobbled street came a black carriage, polished to a mirror sheen despite the snow, drawn by two midnight-colored horses with crested harnesses glinting beneath their breath. The driver wore a heavy wool coat and tall hat, his posture straight and formal. The crest on the carriage door shimmered in the sun like an accusation, a stylized R encircled by laurels. It stopped in front of the boarding house. Georgia rose, her hands trembling. She did not move toward the door. Surely it was for someone else, a mistake, perhaps. But the landlady, Mrs. Tibbins, appeared in the hallway with flushed cheeks and a breathless whisper. "Miss Whitlow, you are summoned. The gentleman waits." Georgia stepped into the parlor with the hesitance of someone stepping into a dream or a trap. The driver offered no explanation, merely opened the door and gestured inside. With heart pounding and gloves hastily pulled over cold fingers, she climbed into the carriage, the interior lined with dark blue velvet and smelling faintly of sandalwood and cigars. The door closed with finality, and the city began to slip past the frosted windows. Fifth Avenue unfolded like a parade of power. Mansions of limestone and marble lined the boulevard, their facades rising like the walls of a new aristocracy. Servants in crisp uniforms shoveled snow from ornate steps, while gas lamps flickered against the grey morning. Georgia sat rigid, her eyes wide as they passed beneath iron arches and up the winding drive of one of the grandest estates she had ever seen. The Rockefeller mansion loomed before her, a towering structure of granite and carved oak, its windows tall and grave, its doors flanked by Corinthian columns. The carriage stopped. A footman in liveried coat opened the door without a word. Georgia stepped out into a world that was not hers. The foyer swallowed her in silence. No staff came to greet her. No instructions were given. Only the tick of a tall brass clock broke the stillness. Her boots, still damp from the street, left faint marks on the marble floor. She stood waiting, unsure, until a door opened on the far side of the hall. He appeared. Lucian Rockefeller. He entered without hurry, his presence as sharp and elegant as the room he inhabited. Tall and grave, dressed in a dark three-piece suit of worsted wool with a black cravat pinned by a silver tie bar, he regarded her not with warmth, but with calculation. His features were striking, high cheekbones, a straight nose, a mouth set in solemn line. His hair was dark, combed back from his forehead with not a single strand out of place, but it was his eyes that unsettled her, grey and distant, as though he were always looking beyond the person before him. "Miss Whitlow," he said, his voice measured, "come with me." Georgia followed him through a gallery of oil portraits and tapestries, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. He opened the door to a study panelled in mahogany, lit by a single window half covered in velvet drapery. A fire burned in the hearth, low and controlled, as if even the flames had been trained to behave. Lucian gestured to a chair. Georgia sat. He did not. "She spoke of you," he said at last. "My mother." Georgia's hands clasped in her lap. "Your mother?" "Eleanor Rockefeller," he said, each syllable precise. "You were the last person she saw before she died." The words struck like a cold draught. I didn't know," Georgia said softly. "I helped her because no one else did." He moved to the hearth, his posture rigid, and stared into the flames. "You touched her. In public. You spoke to her as if she were no different than anyone else." "She collapsed," Georgia said, her voice firmer now. "And I wasn't thinking of titles." He turned to face her. "And yet, she spoke your name when the physician arrived. She insisted you be found." Georgia blinked, caught between disbelief and dread. "Most people," Lucian continued, walking slowly around her, "would have taken that moment as an opportunity. To be seen, to be rewarded, to elevate their station. Did you?" "No," she said, lifting her chin. "I lost my job." He stopped behind her chair. She could feel the heat of his presence, the invisible pressure of his scrutiny. "She was ill for weeks," he murmured, "but never once did she request the doctor change her regimen, never once accused anyone of wrongdoing until that night." Something frightened her. Georgia looked up. "Do you believe I had something to do with that?" "I believe," he said slowly, "that you are either a very foolish woman or a very clever one." Their eyes met. The silence stretched between them like a drawn bowstring. "I didn't come here to be insulted, Mr. Rockefeller." He stepped back, slightly surprised. A shadow of amusement crossed his expression, barely there, gone in an instant. "No, you came here to accept a position." Georgia frowned. "I thought I was summoned for questioning." "You were," he said, "but you are also needed." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "I require a companion," he said. "Someone not afraid to speak plainly. Someone unentangled with my family's expectations." Georgia's breath caught. "A companion? I'm not qualified." "You're not being asked to entertain me, Miss Whitlow," he interrupted, his tone dry. "You are being asked to occupy a space, to observe, to exist here without pretension. My mother believed you, to be honest, and she was rarely wrong." Georgia rose slowly. "What exactly would I be required to do?" "Nothing beyond what you've already done," he said. "Listen, watch, and be truthful when it matters." Her pulse beat in her ears. She looked around the study, the quiet opulence, the air of restrained mourning, and then back at the man before her, whose words were sharp, but whose gaze held something else, something wounded. "I don't know if I belong in a house like this," she whispered. Lucian inclined his head. "Then you are already more qualified than anyone else I might hire." He turned toward the window. "Will you stay, Miss Whitlow?" Georgia closed her eyes for a breath. Outside, the snow began to fall again, blanketing the avenue in silence. She opened them. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." The great doors of the Rockefeller mansion closed behind her, with a sound that echoed like a verdict. Georgia Whitlow stood still for a moment in the marble entryway, her breath shallow, her heart a fragile thing inside her chest. The late afternoon light poured through the arched windows in long, slanted beams, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the still air. She had been shown to a modest chamber, on the third floor. Modest, of course, only by the standards of that house, where even the servants' quarters were adorned with carved mouldings and velvet draperies. The walls were a soft cream, the linens pressed and fragrant, and a small, elegant desk stood beneath the window. From there, Georgia could see the gardens below, manicured paths now lost beneath snow, wrought iron benches, and a single stone fountain frozen mid-pour. But it was not the beauty that unsettled her. It was the silence. The house did not breathe like the hotels and boarding houses she had known. It held its air like a woman in mourning, every creak of the floorboards measured, every whisper of the wind at the windows, a memory. Though richly appointed, the mansion felt emotionally deserted, as though the absence of Eleanor Rockefeller had stripped it of its very rhythm. Georgia descended the staircase to the main floor, unsure of where she belonged. No instructions had been given. The footman who had escorted her earlier had vanished, and the long hallway yawned ahead like a corridor in a museum, quiet, perfect, and unwelcoming. She passed a gilded mirror and caught her reflection. Pale face, tightly pinned hair, and eyes too wide with uncertainty. Her dress, a simple navy wool, hung stiffly in that grand space, a fabric not meant to brush against silk wallpaper or mahogany balustrades. At the far end of the hall, a tall clock struck 4. The chime rang out, and with it came a flicker of motion. A maid slipping into a side corridor, her eyes darting toward Georgia before vanishing around a corner. Whispers followed her that afternoon. Not words she could hear, but glances exchanged, doors that closed softly just before she approached, voices that hushed when her footsteps echoed nearby. The staff wore expressions of politeness, veiled with wariness. She could not blame them. She had not come through the usual path, and in houses like these, position was everything. In the drawing room, she found herself alone among rosewood chairs and ormolu clocks, the scent of lemon oil still fresh in the air. She lingered beside a piano, its surface untouched, its keys hidden beneath a polished lid. Her fingers itched to open it, to play a few notes, to remind herself she was still flesh and feeling in this palace of frost. But she did not. That evening, Mrs. Huxley appeared. The housekeeper was a tall, stern woman with grey hair pulled into a tight knot and eyes as sharp as they were tired. She wore black from collar to hem, her starched cuffs immaculate, and a ring of iron keys hung at her hip with the solemnity of a sceptre. "You'll take your supper in your quarters," she said, her voice low but firm. "At least for now. Mr. Rockefeller keeps irregular hours, and it's not our custom to host companions at table." "I understand," Georgia said softly. "Mrs." Huxley studied her a moment longer, her eyes scanning Georgia's face, not with disdain, but with a searching curiosity. "You're not like the others," she said at last. "I don't know what the others were like," Georgia replied. "That's why I said it," the older woman murmured. Then, after a pause, "If you need anything, you'll find me downstairs. Second door past the kitchens." Georgia inclined her head in thanks. It was the first time since she'd entered the house that someone had spoken to her without veiled suspicion. The following days passed in slow procession. Georgia kept to herself, wandering through the permitted halls, exploring the library with its soaring ceilings and the solarium that overlooked the garden. The air always seemed a few degrees too cold, the light always a touch too dim, as if the house itself resisted warmth. She rarely saw Lucian. Once she glimpsed him passing through the corridor near the study, his dark coat swirling behind him like a shadow. Another morning, he sat in the library when she entered, reading a newspaper beside the fire. He looked up, nodded once, and returned to his reading. No words were exchanged, yet the room had shifted subtly, charged by his presence. Georgia began to notice the details. The way the servants tensed when Lucian's footsteps approached, the way the lamps were never fully lit in certain wings of the house, the way some rooms were always locked. Curiosity led her one evening to the portrait gallery. It was a long corridor on the second floor where ancestors and dignitaries stared down from their golden frames with solemn eyes. Near the end of the hall hung a large oil painting of a woman in a pale blue gown, her golden hair gathered in soft waves, a pearl necklace resting above her heart. Georgia paused before it. The woman's gaze was direct, almost proud. There was elegance in her posture, beauty in her features, and something else, a trace of sadness barely concealed beneath the surface. She was his wife. The voice behind her made Georgia turn. Mrs. Huxley stood a few steps away, her arms folded. "I didn't mean to pry," Georgia said quickly. "She died 5 years ago," the housekeeper said, her tone unreadable. "Her name was Catherine. She drowned." Georgia's breath caught. "In this house?" "No, at their summer estate." Mrs. Huxley looked at the portrait. "It was ruled an accident, but no one speaks of it now, not even him." Silence fell between them. Georgia turned her gaze back to the painting, absorbing the delicate brushwork, the depth of expression. She could not help but wonder what had truly happened, what had left Lucian so closed, so distant from the living world. "You've been kind," Georgia said softly, "when others haven't." Mrs. Huxley's lips pressed into a thin line. "This house was once filled with music and conversation. Eleanor saw to that. Since her passing, it has become a tomb for the living. I don't know what Mr. Rockefeller wants from you, Miss Whitlow, but if you stay, tread carefully." "I have nowhere else to go," Georgia replied honestly. The housekeeper nodded once, then turned to leave. That night, as Georgia lay in bed beneath heavy quilts, she listened to the wind against the windows and thought of all that was unsaid within those walls. She did not yet understand her place, nor the man who had brought her here. But beneath the silence, she could feel something stirring, fragile and unfinished, like a melody waiting to be played. And in that waiting, something inside her began to shift. The late winter light fell gently over the Rockefeller estate like a veil, soft and cold, dimming the edges of everything it touched. Snow clung to the trees beyond the windows, and the garden paths remained undisturbed by footsteps. Inside, the mansion breathed in hushed rhythms, the kind of stillness that echoed not peace, but the weight of things unspoken. Georgia had spent the morning in Eleanor Rockefeller's private sitting room, a chamber that seemed suspended in time. The door had remained closed since the matriarch's death, its key resting in Mrs. Huxley's ring, until the housekeeper handed it to Georgia, with a hesitant nod. "You may begin organizing her things," she had said quietly. "No one else has touched them." The room, nestled in the east wing, was smaller than Georgia expected, more intimate, not a place for hosting, but a sanctuary. The walls were papered in faded rose damask, and the windows were dressed in sheer ivory curtains that let the light through like breath. There was a single armchair by the fire, a writing desk cluttered with correspondence, and a shelf of well-worn books, classics, poetry, and volumes on herbal medicine. Georgia approached the desk with care. She touched nothing at first, only stood there, sensing the echo of Eleanor's presence. The scent of lavender lingered faintly in the air, and upon the desk rested a silver hairbrush, a porcelain teacup with a dried ring of chamomile at its base, and a framed daguerreotype of a young Lucian standing beside his mother, both unsmiling, both proud. As she opened the top drawer, Georgia found bundles of letters, bound with pale ribbon and worn at the edges. Most were mundane, correspondence from charities, notes of thanks, invitations long since expired. But tucked beneath them, folded differently, and tied with a strip of silk rather than ribbon, was a smaller stack. Eleanor's handwriting marked each envelope, though no address was written. Some were sealed, others were not. Georgia's fingers trembled as she untied the silk. The first letter was dated only weeks before the woman's death. "There is a silence in this house that I no longer trust. Eyes that follow, words that go unsaid. I fear not the cold, but the intentions that move beneath civility. I must be cautious with what I drink, what I say, and to whom I say it." Georgia's breath caught. She read it again, more slowly this time, each word tightening her chest. There was no signature, only the letter E and the faintest smear where the ink had run, as though the writer's hand had trembled. She tucked the letter into the pocket of her skirt and scanned the rest quickly. Several were written in the same tone, but this one, this single page, seemed unlike the others. A confession, perhaps, or a warning. That evening, Georgia descended the staircase toward the drawing room, the letter burning like a secret against her hip. The fire was already lit there, and the shadows danced across the carpet. She had meant only to pass through, but the piano by the window drew her in, its lid closed as always, the stool untouched. She paused before it, her heart uncertain. In the silence, the memory of music rose, fragments from her childhood, from church, from moments long buried. She lifted the lid, revealing the ivory keys. They gleamed like truth beneath candlelight. Georgia sat. Her fingers hovered, then found their place as if led by instinct. A simple melody flowed out, gentle, mournful, tender. She played softly, her body swaying with the rhythm, unaware of time or space. The music filled the room like breath, weaving through the mansion's heavy silence. She did not hear him enter. Lucian stood just inside the door, his hands in the pockets of his waistcoat, his gaze fixed on her with a stillness that said he had not meant to intrude, but could not bring himself to leave. When she stopped playing, the silence returned like an old friend. She turned, startled, rising quickly from the bench. "I'm sorry," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask permission." Lucian stepped closer. His eyes had softened, though his posture remained controlled. "That piece," he said, "my mother used to play it, not often, only when she believed no one was listening." Georgia lowered her gaze. "I didn't know. I learned it long ago by ear. I didn't mean—" "You played it as she did," he said, as though it mattered. A silence settled between them again. This one different, not the cold emptiness that filled the rest of the house, but a quiet that trembled with emotion barely restrained. Lucian walked to the window. The light from the fire carved shadows across his face, deepening the lines at the corners of his eyes. "She loved this house," he said, his voice low, "but it changed her in the end. Or perhaps it revealed her fears." Georgia remained by the piano, uncertain if she was meant to respond. Lucian continued, more to himself than to her. "She didn't trust easily. Neither do I. Perhaps that's what binds us, what isolates us. Grief is a cruel tutor." The flicker in his voice struck something deep in Georgia's chest. She looked at him, not at the tycoon the world feared, but at the man beneath, sculpted by loss and silence. "You're not as alone as you think," she said softly. His eyes met hers across the room. The fire crackled once, and in that fragile moment, something passed between them. A recognition, tentative but real. Lucian looked away first. "You should rest." Georgia curtsied faintly. "Good night, Mr. Rockefeller." She climbed the stairs slowly, the melody she had played still echoing in her mind. It was past midnight when she awoke. The sound had been faint, barely a creak, but enough to stir her. Her room was dark, save for the moonlight bleeding through the curtains. She sat up, listening. The hall outside was quiet, the house still. Georgia rose, her bare feet brushing the cold wooden floor. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from something deeper, a sense that something was not right. She lit a candle and crossed the room. Her writing desk had been opened, the drawer left ajar, her books shifted, her trunk unlocked, and her skirt, folded neatly on the chair, was missing the letter she had hidden in the pocket. Gone. She stood frozen, the candlelight flickering in her trembling hand. Someone had been there. Someone had known. And now, someone else held the words Eleanor had written in secret. Words that should have remained between the dead and the living. The mansion breathed its silence once more, but this time it carried the scent of danger, a fire behind the walls, unseen, but already burning. Morning in the Rockefeller mansion arrived not with warmth, but with formality. The chiming of the long case clock in the grand foyer struck 8, echoing across the silent halls like a ritual. Fires were lit in polished hearths by unseen hands, breakfast trays prepared without sound, and the heavy drapes of the east wing pulled back to reveal a pale, reluctant sun. Georgia moved through the corridors with purpose, yet inside she was restless. Sleep had been elusive again. The disappearance of the letter haunted her, a weight that pressed against her ribcage with every breath. Whoever had taken it had entered her private space without hesitation, without fear. It was a violation that left no physical trace, but frayed the edges of her composure. And yet the house carried on, as if nothing had happened, as if secrets could dissolve in morning light. Mrs. Huxley had spoken few words at breakfast, though her eyes lingered on Georgia longer than usual, a silent warning, a quiet question. Georgia could not tell. Later that day, while helping to catalogue items in the family library, Georgia noticed something unusual in the household ledger. A room listed by number, 17, but with no corresponding note or inventory. Her curiosity flared. She traced the layout of the house in her mind. Room 17 should have been along the west corridor near the conservatory, a hallway she had passed many times. That afternoon, when the house fell into its midday stillness, Georgia walked that corridor with measured steps. The portraits lining the walls stared down in solemn judgment. Rockefeller ancestors with gold-trimmed frames and eyes painted to follow. At the far end, past the guest chambers, she found it. A heavy wooden door, its surface polished, its handle brass and cold. It was locked. She paused, heart fluttering. Then, from behind, came the soft voice of the one person in the house whose presence she could never predict. "You're far from the East Wing, Miss Whitlow." Georgia turned. Lucian stood just a few feet away, one hand tucked behind his back, the other resting loosely on his walking cane. He wasn't smiling, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his gaze. "I was only walking," she said, trying not to betray the tension in her throat. He studied the locked door behind her, then looked back at her with a knowing expression. Some doors remain closed for good reason. His words were calm, but they landed like a challenge. He didn't wait for her to respond. With a small nod, he turned and disappeared down the hallway. That night, the tension in the house thickened like fog. A guest had arrived, Lucian's cousin, Victor Lawrence, a man with too smooth charm and the perpetual glint of mischief in his eyes. Georgia first saw him in the drawing room, lounging in a green velvet armchair with a glass of brandy in hand, and a mocking smile stretched across his lips. Well, he said aloud as Georgia passed, addressing no one, and yet everyone. "So this is the new companion. I must say, Cousin Lucian, your taste has taken a rather rustic turn." Laughter flickered around the room, subtle but unmistakable. A murmur, a glance, the sting of amusement drawn like a blade. Georgia paused mid-step. Her cheeks flushed with heat, but she did not answer. She merely turned toward the sideboard to help Mrs. Huxley arrange the silver service. Lucian's voice cut through the room a moment later. "Victor," he said evenly, "I suggest you silence yourself before I do." The laughter died instantly. Victor sat back with a smirk, raising his glass. Always so quick to defend the helpless. Lucian stood slowly from his chair. His presence, already commanding, now filled the room with weight. "Georgia Whitlow has shown more grace and restraint in this house than anyone else seated here, including you." Silence. Mrs. Huxley's hands paused over the china. One of the footmen looked as though he had stopped breathing altogether. Victor, to his credit, laughed softly. "Well said, cousin. I meant no harm, of course." But the damage had been done, and the shift in the air, subtle, electric, did not settle. Later that evening, as Georgia passed through the vestibule on her way to the second floor, Lucian appeared again, as if drawn to her by something neither of them could name. He said nothing at first, only stood in her path, his gaze fixed on her face. "You shouldn't let them get to you," he said finally. "I'm not easily broken, Mr. Rockefeller." He stepped closer. "No, I suspect you're not." She could smell the faint scent of bergamot on his coat, see the fine lines near his mouth, feel the heat of his presence, though neither of them moved. "You didn't have to defend me," she whispered. "I didn't do it for you," he replied, his voice low. "I did it because this house has forgotten how to honor decency." She swallowed. "And you remember." His gaze dropped to her mouth, not with hunger, but with something more dangerous, restraint. "I try," he murmured, though not always successfully. Georgia stepped back, breath caught in her chest. "Good night, Mr. Rockefeller." He nodded slowly, as if choosing silence over something else, something that trembled just beneath the surface. The following morning, while assisting Mrs. Huxley with floral arrangements for the winter parlor, Georgia spoke quietly. "There's a locked room at the end of the west corridor. Room 17. Mrs. Huxley's hands paused mid-trim over a stem of holly. "Some parts of this house hold more than furniture, Miss Whitlow," she said, not looking up. "Some hold memories that prefer to be left alone. Was it Mrs. Rockefeller's?" The housekeeper turned her gaze toward the window. It belonged to his father, and later, to his wife. Georgia stilled. His wife? Mrs. Huxley met her eyes, and for the first time something fragile flickered in the older woman's expression. "Don't ask questions you cannot survive the answers to," she said gently. "Not all truths offer comfort, some only wound." The words settled over Georgia like a chill. She didn't ask more, but that night, as she stood alone before the fire in the sitting room, the flicker of flames cast long shadows behind her. And in the silence, the tension between her curiosity and her restraint grew unbearable, because in the heart of that house, behind its doors, beneath its silence, something was waiting, watching, and Georgia, though she tried to deny it, could feel herself inching closer to the edge of a truth that might change everything. The snow arrived like a whisper, soft and slow at first, drifting in delicate patterns past the tall windows of the Rockefeller mansion. By midday, the sky had turned a bruised grey, the streets outside swallowed in white, and the wind had begun to howl with a steady, rising fury. The house, so often cloaked in silence, now seemed to brace itself against the storm. By early evening, the blizzard had cut off all passage to and from Fifth Avenue. The carriages had been locked away, the gates sealed, and the gas lamps outside flickered weakly against the cold fury of the wind. Servants moved through the halls with lowered voices, lighting more fires, drawing heavier curtains. There would be no visitors, no errands, no escape. Georgia stood at one of the arched windows in the east wing, watching the snow swirl like ghosts across the garden paths. Her hands, folded against her chest, trembled not from the cold, but from the closeness of the air. How still and thick it had grown. A storm outside, and another rising quietly within her. Mrs. Huxley had retired early. The staff had taken to their quarters. The mansion, for all its size, felt suddenly small. Every corridor led back to the same place. Every silence echoed with the sound of thoughts left unspoken. Georgia wandered into the drawing room, where the fire had already been lit. Its warmth spilled across the Persian rug, casting golden light onto the ivory keys of the piano. She stood beside it, trailing her fingers gently along the polished wood, remembering melodies that refused to be forgotten. Then without sound he entered, Lucian. He wore a dark housecoat over his vest, and his hair, usually immaculate, was slightly tousled, as if the storm had reached even him. He stopped just inside the room, his presence deepening the quiet. "I thought I'd find you here," he said. His voice was low, almost hoarse. Georgia turned. "It's the only room that still feels alive." He approached the fire and stood before it, staring into the flames. "The city has disappeared beneath snow," he murmured, "and yet this house remains exactly the same." Georgia hesitated. "It feels different tonight." Lucian looked at her, his eyes darker than usual. "Because you're beginning to see what it truly is, and what it was never meant to be." She stepped closer to the hearth. "You built it." "I inherited it," he corrected with a hollow smile. "Inherited the house, the name, the legacy. But nothing inside it feels mine." The wind outside slammed against the windows, rattling the glass. Georgia flinched, and Lucian moved instinctively, his hand brushing her shoulder in a gesture so brief it almost didn't happen. But it did. "Forgive me," he said softly. "You're not accustomed to storms." "I've seen worse," she whispered, "just not always outside." They sat before the fire, not close but not far either. A velvet settee between them, a space filled with warmth and tension. Georgia wrapped her arms around herself as though remembering something that no longer had a name. Lucian's gaze remained on the fire. "My mother once told me the worst storms are the ones that no one else sees. The kind you endure in silence, behind perfect smiles." Georgia looked at him. "Is that the life you've led?" He answered after a long pause. "I learned early that love in this world is conditional. It must be earned, displayed, performed." "Uddinan yet," she said gently. "You defended me in front of your guests." Lucian turned to her. "Because I saw something real, and I've been starving for real." The silence between them swelled, no longer heavy but fragile, like spun glass suspended between two hearts. Georgia's voice was a whisper. "You hide it well, the ache." He smiled bitterly. "Years of practice. You—" "I didn't have to hide it," she said. "It was invisible from the start. Poverty, loneliness. They don't scandalize the rich. They're simply ignored." Lucian looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not the role she played, but the woman beneath. "And yet you still hope," he said, "even now." She nodded. "Because if I stop hoping, I stop breathing." The fire cracked. The wind howled again, and for a moment there was only them, two lives built on silence, both now unraveling. Lucian reached out, almost without thought, and took her hand. His touch was warm, steady. His thumb brushed over her knuckles with exquisite care. Georgia did not pull away. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her. "You frighten me," he said. She blinked. "Why?" "Because you make me wish I was someone else." The distance between them dissolved. Lucian leaned in, his breath mingling with hers. The moment trembled with promise, raw, unspoken, and unbearably tender. Georgia's heart pounded. She could feel the warmth of his lips so close to her own. Every nerve in her body ached with the nearness, the possibility. But then, as if awakened by the storm itself, Lucian froze. He pulled back sharply, standing at once, the spell broken. His eyes were wild with fury, not at her, but at himself. "This was a mistake," he said hoarsely. "Forgive me." He turned and walked out of the room without another word. Georgia remained seated, her breath still caught between hope and heartbreak. The fire continued to burn, but the warmth had fled with him. The next morning, the storm had passed. The snow glistened beneath the pale blue sky, and the city began to stir again beneath its frozen shroud. Georgia descended to the breakfast room, unsure of what to expect. Mrs. Huxley met her with a folded note. "Mr. Rockefeller asks that you take a leave of absence," she said gently. "Effective immediately." No explanation was given. Georgia took the paper in her trembling hand. No signature, no farewell, only silence. And as the servants packed her trunk and the carriage was readied at the front steps, Georgia stood at the door of the drawing room once more. The piano remained closed. The fire cold. Outside, the snow was melting. But inside her chest, a winter had only just begun. The morning was cruelly beautiful. The sky was an impossible blue, clear and wide above the rooftops of New York, as if the storm had never happened. Snow clung to the railings like lace, and icicles shimmered from the balconies of the grand houses along Fifth Avenue. But inside Georgia's chest, everything remained grey and cold. She stood alone in the guest chamber, assigned to her only weeks before, now stripped of warmth, stripped of place. Her trunk sat half-filled at the foot of the bed. Folded garments rested in careful piles, and her gloves, worn but well kept, waited beside a hatbox on the vanity. There had been no word from Lucian beyond the message delivered by Mrs. Huxley. No farewell, no explanation, only absence. Georgia moved through the room with slow precision. Her fingers brushed over the spine of a poetry book she had borrowed from the family library, a collection of Longfellow's verses bound in worn leather. It was wedged beneath another volume, as if someone had returned it in haste. When she lifted it, something fell from between the pages. A locket, not ornate, but old. Oval, brass, the kind of jewelry once worn beneath layers of mourning crepe. Georgia knelt to pick it up, turning it over in her hand. The clasp was delicate, and when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was not a miniature portrait, but a tightly folded square of parchment. She unfolded it with trembling hands. The ink was faded, the penmanship unmistakably Eleanor's. The letter bore no greeting to Lucian. Instead it read, "To the girl who offered mercy without knowing my name, if you find this, then I trust you still walk these halls. Trust is not a gift I've offered freely in my final years, but you, dear stranger, showed me kindness without calculation. I have grown fearful, not of death itself, but of how it will come. I have begun to suspect that what weakens me is not time, but intention. A quiet threat lives beneath this roof, slow and patient. I do not yet know who. But if anything should happen to me, trust your instincts and trust no one who smiles too easily." There was no signature, only the faint press of Eleanor's initials. Georgia sat slowly on the edge of the bed, the letter trembling in her hands. The realization settled in her chest like ice. Eleanor believed she had been poisoned, silently, deliberately, and she had entrusted Georgia, not her son, not her staff, with the truth. The memory of the missing letter returned to her with new weight. Someone had known she was getting too close. Without thinking, she stood and slipped the locket and note into her coat pocket. Her departure would wait. She could not leave with this knowledge sealed away. She had to see Lucian, speak to him, warn him. The walk through the snow-covered streets was colder than she remembered. The wind pierced her cloak, and the light hurt her eyes. But the fire within her pushed her forward. By the time the mansion gates rose before her again, she was breathless, her cheeks flushed with urgency. The butler opened the door with surprise, though he said nothing. Georgia stepped inside, the warmth of the house nearly dizzying after the cold. "I must speak with Mr. Rockefeller," she said. The man hesitated. "He has not left his room since the storm, Miss Whitlow. He is unwell." A cold thread laced her spine. "What kind of illness?" "He's fevered, weak. Dr. Alcott has been summoned, but has yet to arrive." Without waiting for permission, Georgia turned toward the staircase. The butler called after her, but she didn't stop. Her boots echoed against the marble steps as she climbed toward the second floor, toward the east wing, where Lucian kept his private rooms. Mrs. Huxley met her outside the door. The older woman's face was pale, her lips drawn into a tight line. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "I must see him," Georgia replied. "I think I know something." Mrs. Huxley studied her for a long moment. Then with a sigh, she stepped aside. The bedroom beyond was dim, the heavy curtains drawn to shield against the morning glare. A fire crackled softly in the hearth. Lucian lay beneath a thick quilt, his skin pale and his brow damp with sweat. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Georgia crossed the room slowly. She knelt beside the bed and reached for his hand. It was warm, too warm, feverish. "Lucian," she whispered. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered. For a moment his eyes opened, glazed and unfocused, but then they locked onto her face with a faint glimmer of recognition. "You came back," he murmured. "I had to." She pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. Mrs. Huxley moved quietly around the room, pouring water, preparing clean linens. "What happened?" Georgia asked. "He complained of dizziness 2 days ago," Mrs. Huxley said. "Refused to rest. Said it was nothing." Georgia's gaze dropped to the tray on the nightstand. A porcelain teacup rested there, the contents half finished. She lifted it, sniffed. The scent was floral, faint but familiar. Chamomile, perhaps lavender, a blend that might soothe or sedate. Who prepared this? Mrs. Huxley hesitated. Victor did. He said he brought it from the apothecary himself. Georgia's chest tightened. She pulled the locket from her coat, opened it, and handed the letter to the housekeeper. Mrs. Huxley read it in silence, her face shifting from surprise to alarm. "She feared poison," Georgia said softly. "And now Lucian's falling ill the same way she did." The housekeeper pressed her lips together. "I should have known. I should have listened." "You can help me now," Georgia said. "We need to find the herbs he used, the blend, the container, anything that will tell us what's in that tea." Mrs. Huxley nodded and left the room swiftly. Georgia remained beside Lucian, holding his hand between both of hers. His skin burned beneath her touch, but his fingers curled faintly around hers. "I'm not leaving you," she whispered. "Not again." He didn't respond, but the corner of his mouth twitched as if he had heard. The fire crackled, the snow melted slowly on the windowsills. And in that quiet chamber filled with sickness and secrets, Georgia felt the first true stirrings of courage rise within her. Someone had tried to silence Eleanor. Now they were trying to silence Lucian, but she would not let the house devour another soul. Not while she still had breath. A hush had fallen over the mansion. Not the stillness of routine or reverence, but a silence weighted with expectation. Like the air before lightning strikes, the fireplaces crackled behind closed doors. Footsteps were softer, and even the maids whispered more than usual. Something was shifting beneath the surface of the house, and Georgia could feel it in her bones. Lucian remained in bed, his fever mercifully beginning to ebb. The doctor, summoned late, had diagnosed exhaustion and nerves, but Georgia knew better. His decline had been no accident. The patterns mirrored Eleanor's illness too precisely, and the memory of the locketed letter pressed constantly against her side. She moved quickly now, purpose guiding her every step. With Mrs. Huxley's discreet help, she began a quiet investigation. The first discovery came in the butler's pantry, tucked behind a row of ordinary tins. A silver container labelled Herbal Sleep Blend, prepared by Lawrence and Sons, December 1896. The seal was intact, the design professional, but the contents, they smelled wrong. A sweetness beneath the chamomile, something metallic that clung to her throat even after she closed the lid. The second clue was found in Victor's guest chamber. She had slipped in while he was away in the city and opened his travel case, concealed behind a screen. Inside were neatly folded shirts, pressed gloves, a ledger bound in dark leather, one that bore no official insignia, only the initials LR burned faintly into the corner. The figures inside were meticulous, with columns of numbers and transactions. But some of the dates and names, especially those surrounding the estate's accounts, did not align with the ledgers Georgia had glimpsed in Lucian's study weeks prior. She had only moments before she had to leave the room, but it was enough. Enough to see that large sums had been moved, that signatures had been copied, that trust had been manipulated. By the time Victor returned that evening, Georgia had already planned everything. She waited in the solarium. The room, with its tall glass windows and cold tile floors, had been Eleanor's favorite place to take tea. Now, winter vines curled along the frames, and the snow outside had begun to fall again in gentle, silent flakes. The tea service stood waiting at the table, 2 cups, a steaming pot, and the silver tin from the pantry. Victor arrived with his usual smile, polished and practiced. He wore a deep burgundy waistcoat and held his gloves in one hand. "Miss Whitlow," he said, bowing his head slightly. "What a pleasure to be summoned by the house's newest mistress." "I only requested your time," she answered coolly, "and I thought this room fitting. Your aunt liked to sit here, didn't she?" He tilted his head, amused. "Indeed, though she always preferred stronger tea than that which soothed the nerves." Georgia gestured to the table. "Please, sit." He obeyed, removing his coat and placing it over the chair's back. His eyes scanned the room, and Georgia could see him calculating already. She poured the tea carefully. "I believe you brought this blend, did you not, from your apothecary?" "I did." His smile remained. "A rare combination of lavender, valerian, and chamomile, very relaxing, perfect for those under pressure." "Would you drink it now?" she asked, offering him a cup. Victor's brow lifted slightly. "Why the formality?" "No ceremony. Only curiosity. I've grown rather suspicious of teas lately." He hesitated. The cup remained untouched. Georgia sat opposite him, her voice calm. "Did you know your aunt wrote letters before her death? Letters in which she expressed fear, of being watched, of being weakened slowly, deliberately." Victor said nothing. "She didn't name anyone," Georgia continued, "but she mentioned one who smiled too easily." His lips twitched at that. "And now you believe I poisoned my own aunt?" "I believe you stood to gain the most," she said softly. "You forged financial documents, you moved funds under her name, and when she grew suspicious, she fell ill." He leaned back in the chair, exhaling as though mildly annoyed. "My dear girl, do you have any idea what you're implying?" "I'm not implying," she said. "I'm accusing." His eyes darkened. "And what proof do you have?" Georgia reached into her pocket and placed 2 items on the table. The letter from Eleanor, the tea tin. "I had the tea examined," she said. "Arsenic, in trace amounts. Enough to weaken, confuse, induce fatigue, just like it did with Eleanor, just like it's done to Lucian." Victor stared at the objects, his expression unreadable. For the first time his charm cracked, just slightly, like a mask held too tightly for too long. "Lucian is recovering," Georgia said, "and I will show him everything." Victor stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the tile. "You forget your place, Miss Whitlow. You are a guest, a servant in all but name. You think anyone will believe your word over mine?" Georgia rose as well, her voice steady. "I think truth doesn't care for rank, and neither does loyalty." He stared at her for a long moment, then took his coat without another word. His silence said more than any outburst could have. By the next morning, Victor Lawrence was gone. No formal goodbye, no note, only a quietly packed bag and a carriage ordered before sunrise. Georgia entered Lucian's study just after dawn. The fire had been lit, though the air remained cool. He sat in an armchair by the hearth, wrapped in a dark robe, pale but alert. He looked up when she entered. "You returned." "I never truly left," she said. Lucian studied her face, something shifting behind his tired eyes. "Mrs. Huxley told me you stayed, that you defied every instruction I gave you." "I couldn't walk away," she said, "not when I knew something was wrong." He lowered his gaze as if ashamed. "I wasn't strong enough to protect this house, or myself." Georgia moved closer, kneeling beside him. "But you were strong enough to let someone else try." He reached for her hand. She gave it willingly. "You may have saved my life," he said. She shook her head gently. "No, Lucian. I only reminded you it was still worth saving." His fingers tightened around hers, the tremble in his grip revealing more than words could. "Why did you come back?" he asked, voice thick with emotion. Georgia met his gaze without hesitation. "Because you matter." He closed his eyes briefly, as if the weight of those words pressed into his soul, and in the quiet morning light, as the house breathed again for the first time in weeks, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The truth had been uncovered, the danger past, but the deeper wounds, the ones beneath the skin, beneath the silence, were just beginning to heal. The first whispers began with a gloved hand, raised to a fan. Then a murmur behind a teacup, a knowing glance exchanged across the polished floor of Delancey's apothecary. By the end of the week, The rumor had found its way into the parlors of Fifth Avenue's finest homes, carried on the lips of women who wore silk gowns and smiled as they destroyed reputations with a single phrase. "She was a maid, you know, at the Wellington." The words traveled like wildfire, devouring the carefully constructed silence that had protected the Rockefeller name for generations. A servant, living under that roof. They spoke of her as though she were a scandalous relic, unearthed from the wrong side of the city, a curiosity barely tolerated, a disruption to the quiet order of things. Never mind what she had done. Never mind that Lucian himself had invited her to stay. In their eyes, Georgia Whitlow was an aberration. She heard none of it directly, but she felt it in the way the household staff looked at her, in the sudden coldness of the baker's wife at the back gate, in the tightening of Mrs. Huxley's jaw each time a letter bearing an unfamiliar seal arrived. And still, Lucian said nothing. He had not spoken of the gala until 2 days before. It was a charity event, hosted by the Whitfield family, with whom the Rockefellers had long shared both financial interests and social obligations. Lucian had declined the last several invitations, but this time he intended to go. "You'll accompany me," he said simply, setting down his tea as though it were a decision as casual as an afternoon stroll. Georgia looked up from the book she had been pretending to read. Surely someone else would be more appropriate. His eyes met hers across the quiet of the library. "There is no one else, I trust." The tailor came the next morning. Eleanor's old lavender gown, rarely worn, preserved in camphor, was removed from its case and laid across Georgia's bed. The fabric was rich but soft, trimmed in delicate pearl embroidery, with a high neckline and fitted sleeves. It had been tailored for elegance, not spectacle. Mrs. Huxley oversaw the alterations in silence. When the final stitch was done, she looked at Georgia in the mirror and said quietly, she would have approved. The night of the gala arrived beneath a sky full of silver clouds. Snow threatened again, but the wind held still. Carriages lined the entrance to the Whitfield mansion like a procession of black swans. Lamps glowed against frosted windows, and the sound of an orchestra floated gently into the night. Georgia stepped out of the Rockefeller carriage with her heart pounding in her chest. The lavender gown moved with her like water, its weight unfamiliar, its elegance both comforting and disarming. Lucian offered his arm without a word. He wore black with a grey silk cravat, his presence composed and unreadable. Inside, the ballroom gleamed with candlelight and gold leaf. Chandeliers hung like frozen stars, and laughter rang through the high ceilings with practiced ease. Couples twirled beneath the polished mirrors, and crystal glasses clinked with champagne. Georgia was not announced. She walked beside Lucian, sensing the shift in the room before a single word was spoken. Heads turned, fans fluttered, dresses swished aside with deliberate movements. The music continued, but conversation slowed. "Is that her?" "The maid. She has nerve. I'll give her that." Georgia held her head high. Her spine was straight, her hands folded in front of her with quiet dignity. She did not meet their eyes. She did not lower hers. At first, they simply ignored her, pretended she wasn't there. Then came the whispers. A young woman in emerald laughed behind her hand. A matron in brocade leaned toward her husband with a smile that did not reach her eyes. A man near the punch bowl muttered something crude, which drew chuckles from a circle of overdressed gentlemen. Lucian said nothing. He moved beside her like a ghost, quiet and still, as if he did not notice the barbs in the air. Georgia's cheeks burned, but she did not falter. Each step was a triumph. Each breath, an act of defiance. They moved toward the far end of the ballroom, where the orchestra played beneath a vaulted arch. The conductor raised his baton, and a waltz began to swell. And then, without warning, Lucian stopped. He turned toward her slowly, then toward the room. His voice, when it came, was calm and clear. "You may not know this woman," he said. The orchestra faltered. The bow of the first violin slid off key. A ripple moved through the crowd. Lucian took Georgia's hand and raised it gently. "But I do." She froze, her heart thundering. "This is Georgia Whitlow," he said, his voice louder now. "She is not here because of birthright. She is not here because of name or fortune. She is here because she saved my life." Silence fell, not the polite silence of curiosity, but the full, breathless quiet of shock. Lucian continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "She stood when others fell. She told the truth when it would have been easier to lie. She gave dignity to a house that had forgotten what it meant to feel." He looked back at her then. "Just her. I owe her more than I can ever repay." The words settled in the air like snowfall. No one moved. No one laughed. Georgia felt the world shift beneath her feet, not with fear, but with gravity, with belonging. Lucian stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm once more. The conductor, after a beat, lifted his baton again. The music returned, but the room had changed. The laughter was quieter now, the glances more thoughtful. A few nodded in acknowledgement as she passed. One or two even offered faint, hesitant smiles. But Georgia did not need their approval. She had already won. That night, as they returned home, the streets of New York glowed in the reflection of gas lamps and carriage lights. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and slow. Lucian helped her down from the carriage and offered her his arm, but said nothing. As they crossed the threshold of the Rockefeller mansion, Georgia paused. She looked up at the windows glowing with firelight. The home that had once belonged to grief now stood waiting for something else. "Thank you," she said softly. Lucian's gaze met hers in the shadows of the grand hall. "For what?" "For seeing me." He did not smile. He simply looked at her, as if he always had. And in the quiet that followed, Georgia knew she had not only reclaimed her dignity, she had become something greater than the rumors ever imagined. Not a maid, not a mistress, but a woman no one would ever overlook again. Snow blanketed the grounds of the Rockefeller estate in a hush that softened every sound and stilled even the wind. The windows glowed with amber light as dusk descended over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Winter had come in full, not with the fury of a storm, but with a quiet persistence that seemed to echo the transformation unfolding behind the mansion's stone walls. It was in Eleanor's study that Lucian stood waiting, not in evening dress or formal posture, but in a charcoal wool coat and soft linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up, a book still open on the desk behind him. The fire crackled low, casting dancing shadows on the walls that once knew only silence. The room had not changed much since that fateful autumn day Georgia had first crossed its threshold, except now there were small signs of life. A shawl draped across the armchair, a potted plant thriving near the window, a tea tray set for two. Georgia paused at the doorway, her breath catching softly in her throat. She had come from the library, a stack of books in her arms, unaware of what awaited her here. She blinked once, twice, sensing something different in the air, something weightier than words. Lucian turned when he heard her footsteps, his expression unreadable for a heartbeat. Then he crossed the room, took the books gently from her arms, and placed them aside with care. When he turned back, he did not speak immediately. His hands hovered near hers before he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and drew out a small, velvet box. "There are many places I could have chosen," he said quietly, "but none felt more honest than here." Georgia looked down at the familiar carpet beneath her feet. Her heart beat slowly and deeply, as if giving her time to understand. Lucian opened the box, not with drama, not with ceremony, but with reverence. Inside lay a ring, not a stone of grandeur, not a spectacle for society to gawk at. It was a delicate band of rose gold, etched with faint vine-like patterns, and a single pearl at its center. "It belonged to my mother," Lucian said. "She was a quiet woman, kind, but often overlooked. She never envied the wives of men richer or louder. She taught me that mercy was the rarest form of courage. His voice grew softer. It took me far too long to remember that lesson. Georgia's eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself in the presence of so much gentleness. "I'm not asking you because it's proper," he continued, "or because people expect it. I'm asking you because when I wake, it's your voice I want to hear. Because this house only feels like home when you're in it. Because I need no further proof that what grew between us was real." He lowered the box slightly, offering the words as a man stripped of armor, bare in his truth. "If you say no, you may stay. I will not take kindness from you simply because I love you." A silence fell, not heavy, but sacred. Georgia stepped forward. Her gloved fingers brushed his as she closed the box and held it between their hands. "I will not marry you for your name," she whispered, "nor for the wealth nor the shelter. I will marry you because I watched you grieve without drowning, because you listened even when pride begged you not to, because you never touched me without asking." She lifted her eyes to his, full of quiet strength. "And because I'm no longer the woman who walked into this house last fall." Lucian's breath trembled, and in that moment, nothing else existed but the stillness between them. He slipped the ring onto her finger, slowly, with the care of a man laying a vow upon holy ground. No witnesses, no orchestra, just the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the memory of Eleanor, whose portrait remained above the hearth, smiling faintly, as if at peace. The days that followed moved gently, like the thaw of early spring, even as snow still framed the windows. Word of their engagement spread, but it was met not with scandal or outrage, but a kind of awe. The elite might have muttered behind closed doors, but few dared to speak ill publicly of the woman who had stood beside Lucian at the Whitfield Gala and faced the city's cruelty without flinching. The Rockefeller estate transformed subtly, but undeniably. Music returned. Sometimes in the soft chords Georgia played in the drawing room, sometimes in the laughter of guests who now felt welcomed, not measured. The rooms no longer echoed with absence. They breathed. Mrs. Huxley retired with grace. She had overseen every drawer, every change, every ceremony with her usual discretion, but when the time came to step aside, she did so with a dignity that moved Georgia to tears. "I served Eleanor," she said, folding a shawl into her trunk. "And now in you, I see her legacy live on. You were never just a maid, my dear. You were always someone worth noticing." Her departure was not mourned with wails, but honoured with a private luncheon, where Lucian stood and toasted the woman who had kept the household upright through decades of grief, change, and rebirth. As for Lucian's cousin, the scandal of his manipulation and petty cruelty had reached enough ears to ensure he was never welcomed in the city again. There was no formal announcement, no public disgrace, only silence, and silence in New York society was exile enough. On the first afternoon of spring, a soft warmth filtered through the tall windows of the west sitting room. The fire had burned low, casting a golden hue across the walls. Georgia sat at a small writing table, sorting through old letters. Her hair, once braided tightly, now fell in soft waves pinned at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple house dress of ivory muslin. Her sleeves rolled as she worked, her fingers pausing on a ribbon tucked between two pages. Lucian entered quietly. He did not speak, only watched her for a moment before crossing to the shelves. He took down a small box, once stored behind volumes of Eleanor's music manuscripts. He placed it before Georgia without a word. She recognized it instantly. Eleanor's music box. Its surface was polished walnut, with mother-of-pearl inlays forming the image of a swan upon water. Georgia traced the lid slowly, reverently. With a soft breath, she opened it. The melody that spilled forth was tender, melancholic, full of longing and grace. It filled the room with something deeper than nostalgia, something close to forgiveness. Beside the box stood a small framed photograph, a recent addition, Lucian, Eleanor, Georgia. The three of them, captured not in some formal studio, but in the garden on a mild autumn day. Lucian seated, Eleanor standing beside him with a parasol, and Georgia behind them, her hands gently resting on Eleanor's shoulders. They looked not like a proper family, but like a found one. Georgia reached out and brushed the frame with her fingers. Then she leaned forward, eyes misted, and whispered into the melody, "Your kindness lives on." The clock chimed in the hall. Outside, the first buds of spring waited to bloom beneath the melting snow. And within those walls, once shadowed by sorrow, the cost of mercy had been paid. In love, in memory, in the quiet triumph of two hearts that had learned to heal. Spring arrived gently in Newport, brushing the shores of Rhode Island with the scent of sea salt and lilacs. The grand estates that once echoed with the stiff rituals of old money had softened, their iron gates no longer symbols of exclusion, but of time's quiet reshaping of pride. At the edge of Cliff Walk, where the waves whispered against the stone below, the Rockefeller estate remained. Older now, weathered by storms and softened by laughter. Its windows no longer guarded secrets, but held the reflections of a life that had defied every expectation. Georgia stood on the veranda, her hands resting on the railing as the wind played with the loose curls escaping her chignon. She wore a simple lavender shawl, the same hue as the gown she had once worn to a gala 11 years ago. The ocean before her shimmered beneath the morning sun, and somewhere inside the house a piano melody floated gently through the air. A child's laughter rang out across the garden. Then another joined it. Two girls, twins, barely 10, chased each other around a flowering dogwood tree. One had Lucian's dark hair and George's green eyes, while the other bore Eleanor's pale golden tones and the fierce spirit of a girl born of mercy and courage. Georgia smiled as she watched them, her heart swelling in the space where fear once lived. Lucian appeared behind her, his arm slipping naturally around her waist. His hair was touched with silver at the temples now, and the lines at his eyes had deepened, not with worry, but with the laughter of days well lived. "They're going to tear the garden apart," he murmured with a smile. Georgia leaned into him. "Let them. Eleanor would have adored it." He nodded. She would have insisted on serving them tea and teaching them sonatas. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the waves and the breeze and the soft, steady ticking of time. Inside, the house had changed. The portrait of Eleanor still hung in the study, but now it shared space with photographs. Georgia at the conservatory's opening gala, Lucian giving a speech at a fundraiser for working-class scholarships, and the girls playing in the snow with Mrs. Huxley, who had returned each Christmas despite her retirement, never missing a birthday or holiday. The cousin, long exiled, had squandered what little favor remained. His letters, filled with regret and requests for help, remained unanswered. Mercy had its limits, but the city had changed. Slowly, unevenly, but it had changed. The scandal of the maid who married the tycoon had faded into something else, something that whispered possibility into the hearts of women who once believed their worth was written in linen and lineage. Georgia had become a quiet symbol of change, not through speeches or rebellion, but by existing, firmly, gracefully, where no one expected her to thrive. In her letters to the girls at the conservatory, she wrote of Eleanor's music, of second chances, of love that begins not with fire, but with kindness. Lucian's business had grown, but not at the cost of his soul. He walked into rooms with Georgia at his side, no longer ashamed of his grief, no longer hiding behind scotch and silence. He taught his daughters that strength was not loud, and love was not owed, but chosen again and again. That afternoon, the family gathered in the drawing room, where the music box still sat atop the mantel. The girls asked to hear the melody again. Mama's favorite, they called it. Georgia wound the key. The notes drifted out like memories. She closed her eyes as the music played, remembering the cold autumn day she had arrived, unwanted and unseen. How strange that this house, once a place of quiet sorrow, had become the heartbeat of her life. Lucian took her hand. They sat together as the girls twirled across the floor. their laughter carrying like bells across the years. And as the last note played, Georgia whispered to herself as she had once before, only this time with joy, "Your kindness lives on." And it did, in music, in daughters, in the quiet, unshakable love that had grown not in luxury, but in mercy. Some stories are born not from grandeur, but from the quiet courage to love beyond shame, status, or the weight of the past. Georgia and Lucian's journey reminds us that healing doesn't come all at once. It arrives in small moments of grace, in second chances, and in the unwavering decision to see worth where others saw only ruin. From the dusty servants' quarters to the golden halls of Newport, this wasn't just a tale of love. It was a testament to resilience, to the power of kindness, and to the beauty of choosing someone not for what they offer the world, but for how they make you feel seen in it. If this story touched your heart, let us know by writing the word mercy in the comments. That single word will tell us you stayed with Georgia and Lucian all the way through, and that their legacy of tenderness and courage reached you too. We invite you to share this story with someone who believes in the quiet power of love, or who needs a reminder that it's never too late to begin again. And if your heart is still craving more tales of passion, redemption, and unforgettable heroines, take a look at the other stories waiting for you in the cards above. Each one is crafted with care, just for you. Thank you for being part of this moment. We'll be waiting for you in the next love story.